presentation prior to mine is a good segue because we actually use some of the techniques he advocates in variable importance and looking for specific effects of features. So that's great. It ties together nicely. So I'm at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm in our Data Science and Analytics Institute. And a lot of my research focuses on challenges in the public policy sector. What I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to talk about the gateway hypothesis and augment it by considering the age of first use of drugs on the likelihood of subsequent illicit drug use. So let me start off by reminding some of you, or perhaps introducing to some of you, what the gateway hypothesis is. Even if you haven't heard of it described this way, you've certainly come across it. It was a theory that was developed quite a while ago by Denise Candle in 1975, where she maintained that drug initiation follows a normative pattern. So it's very unlikely for a substance user to begin their drug use by initiating a hard drug such as cocaine prior to using a more common drug such as alcohol or tobacco. In fact, she strengthened that claim by saying that it was extremely unlikely for you to progress to harder drug use before going through a sequence of stages. And in 1975, this was done through a longitudinal behavior study in New York among high school students, where they found that drug initiation began with the use of beer or wine, progressed into a second stage with the use of cigarettes or hard liquor, and then kind of flipped between the two, progressed to the third stage with the use of marijuana, and the fourth stage, the beginning of the use of other illicit drugs. So that was the theory that they had proposed back then. Since then, there have been a lot of studies that have gone back and tested it, and the patterns that she had predicted have been found to have been observed in many other countries, including the few that I've gotten here. There have been very few studies, however, that actually look at the age of first use of initiation of different drugs and what types of sequences of ages of first use exist. They really focused on the sequence of the drug itself. Some of the few studies that did look at age of first use found that among young subjects, there was a link between alcohol and marijuana use formed by cigarettes, and that the ages of first use, which in this presentation I describe as AFUs, have actually declined from the 1920s through the 1970s. There have been some more recent studies that have also reinforced those initial normative patterns that Candle had predicted. There is a positive association between quasi-legal drugs, and by quasi-legal, I mean a drug that is legal somewhere in the United States at some age. So for our purposes, we're talking about tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana. Those are quasi-legal drugs. Illicit drugs would be those drugs that are not legal anywhere, such as cocaine or heroin. So there was found to be an association between the use of quasi-legal drugs and subsequent prescription opioid abuse. There was a study that linked smoking cigarettes in the 8th and 10th grade to marijuana and cocaine use in their senior year of high school, and a finding that said that if your first experience with cannabis was a positive one, meaning the user enjoyed it, that it actually amplifies the association with further illicit drug use. One of the things that's important to point out about the gateway hypothesis is that it is not a theory of causality. So in other words, it does not say that your cocaine use is dictated by the fact that you used marijuana. It doesn't make that claim. It also doesn't make the claim of definitive progression. So if you use marijuana, that does not mean that you are absolutely going to use cocaine. And we obviously know that that's true. But again, the gateway hypothesis would tell you that if you are going to use cocaine, you will have used marijuana prior to doing so. There are some gaps in this really big body of literature. Almost all of the studies around the gateway hypothesis have focused on studies of small scale, oftentimes so that the researcher could directly observe the process. Although when I say directly observe, keep in mind that almost all of these studies, virtually all of them, rely on the user's indication that they've used a drug, right? So the researcher is not directly observing the use of a drug. They are instead relying on the user telling them when and how they used a drug. Again, these prior literature considered sequences only, not the ages of first use. And almost all of them required the development of an a priori hypothesis and the testing of that hypothesis that would limit the scope of the further analysis. So in our work, we try to address these gaps. So what we do is we're revisiting the gateway hypothesis, and this time we are looking at the ages of first use of the quasi-legal drugs as features into a model that predicts the likelihood of illicit drug use later on. The data that we use for this comes from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. The data study is the data that we selected was from 2016 to 2019. 2020, the survey didn't happen because of COVID. 2021 was limited. So it's only recently that you could kind of pick this up, this data set up and run with it. But at the time, what we had available to us was 2019 was the earliest. Again, this is a classification problem where we're classifying the likelihood of use of an illicit drug as a function of the age of first use of quasi-legal drugs. And in machine learning speak, we talk about the outcome variable being whether or not that use occurs, and the features going into the model being those ages of first use. And I'm skipping some of the technical details in here, but what we do for age of first use is you might say, well, if somebody never did use one of these quasi-legal drugs, then how would you describe their age of first use? Well, the age of first use feature is actually the inverse of their age. So if they never used it, you've got a value that is essentially infinity for a non-used drug. And of course, the other end of the spectrum is zero. Neither one of those two things actually occur in the feature set, but we deal with the inverse of the AFU to come up with a smooth mathematical space for our features. We use two machine learning techniques to study this problem, and these two were selected because they are explainable. So as Matthew Hanauer talked before me, there's explainability and results. And this is an example where we've got two actually high-performing models that do both lend themselves to good explainability. Decision tree classification is a method that seeks to split up points in your features and allocate observations into those split points where they start to concentrate into either a positive or a negative class. Logistic regression, you are probably more familiar with. That's a technique where you're trying to predict an outcome based upon a linear combination of features, and the logistic regression allows us to kind of explicitly determine that relationship between age of first use and probability of subsequent illicit use. Both models did a really, really good job of predicting illicit drug use. And so in the data science world, one of the measures of the quality of a model is something called the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve. And in general, generally speaking, if it's above 0.7, you're really happy. And both of these did very well. Again, it's a pretty simple model, so we could expect it to perform fairly well as long as these features were involved with being able to predict the outcome variable, and they are. And from the studies, we can look to see what the most important individual feature is in predicting that later illicit drug use. And by far and away, the age of first use of marijuana was the most important predictive feature. And when we talk about these models, the decision tree model in particular allows for very complicated nonlinear interactions between the features. So when we talk about a variable importance score, we're not just talking about its importance by itself. We're talking about its importance by itself and in combination with other features. So when you see a very high importance score in a model like this, then it's saying that the age of first use of marijuana is very important. The age of first use of marijuana in conjunction with the age of first use of tobacco is very important. All these different combinations would involve marijuana lend an increase to its importance. Let's go on to kind of talk about what we can do to turn this conclusion into something a little bit more quantitative. The decision tree model gives you a pretty nice map. You could use it if you wanted to as like a question survey to indicate someone's likelihood of using an illicit drug based on their answers to a certain set of questions. And the top question would be considered the one that first determines your split into likelihood of use or not use. And that split says that you are more likely to use illicit drugs if the age of first use of marijuana occurred at a point less than 16.4 years of age. And when we look at the splits in the decision tree below that level, we find that subsequent splits after we determine the early age marijuana use is important, the next split would be based on alcohol use. So the interpretation there is that the combination of marijuana use under the age of 16 and alcohol use under the age of 18 greatly increases your likelihood of using illicit drugs later in life. And then beyond that, any tobacco use on top of that drives further positive classification. The linear regression model gives us the ability to come up with a stronger mathematical relationship between these ages of first use and likelihood of subsequent illicit drug use. And so I've got a simple chart here where we take the coefficients in the linear regression model for just the 3 standalone drugs, and we look at the relationship of those standalone drugs and the probability of illicit drug use. And you can see here that there's an exponential relationship, a strong exponential relationship between the age of first use of marijuana and the probability of subsequent illicit drug use. So it's kind of reinforces what the decision tree model told us, which is that things start to really take off when you get to marijuana use at around 16 years of age. So let's talk about the societal importance of these findings. The main thing that we want to point out is that marijuana age of first use does matter. So the younger you initiate marijuana use, the more likely you are to use an illicit drug. And by the way, that age of first use of marijuana far outweighs the age of first use of alcohol and tobacco and your likelihood of using more illicit drugs. We make no claims about why that's the case. So you could come up with studies to try and find out why that's the case. So for example, if I live in a state where all marijuana use is illegal and I have a young marijuana user, you could hypothesize that that young marijuana user is inherently more of a risk taker because they're violating a stronger law in a state where marijuana is not legal. And that is probably, that's a very valid hypothesis, well worth testing, right? So again, we're not talking about causality. We're talking about an outcome here, and causality requires further research. The other thing that we are claiming that we are concerned about is that an increase in supply leads to an increase in use. So you already saw in a prior presentation, I believe it was Thursilla's, where the amount of marijuana use in the United States has skyrocketed, and primarily that's as a result of legalization. So that's not a surprise. If a substance is illegal and it becomes legal, it's a kind of a simple macroeconomic argument to say, well, then you're more likely going to see more use of it. If you're going to see more likely use of it, you're probably going to see more likely use by youths. So what we are advocating is that as legalization continues in the United States, we have to do a better job of putting in place stronger safeguards around early initiation. There are some efforts to do this. I live in the state of Washington. There was a good report that was given to the state at the end of the year that talked about the dangers of increasing THC concentrations in the marijuana supply. And in that recommendation set, they did advocate for stronger safeguards around early initiation. You can also make arguments around packaging requirements. You can strengthen laws around distribution of marijuana to youth. There are a lot of things you can do to try and limit the access of marijuana to youth, and we strongly advocate those types of actions. The topics that we see being relevant for further exploration include picking up the NSDUH survey set and do a study with the different surveys over time to see if AFU sequences have changed much due to marijuana legalization. And we can also study the AFUs of marijuana to see if they have declined as legalization takes hold in the United States. So that's the presentation. I'll stop now and open it up for questions.